Faith builds. Let's get started. The Blasphemous Blade, which is the best weapon in the game, has only gotten better since the release of the DLC due to things like the Talisman of the Dread, which is a talisman that literally boosts your magma-based damage by 15%, and the skill of this weapon, which is probably the best unique skill in the game, is classified as a magma-based source, and yes, this does stack with the Shard of Alexander to make this skill do monstrous damage. Like, it already just melts a lot of enemies, but now we just have a talisman to just make it do way more. And yes, it just gives you health regen on every single hit, and just goes incredibly far, staggers enemies pretty well. Easy to spam. So yes, the build is basically just building around spamming this skill. Gonna have the Fire Scorpion charm equipped, obviously the Faith tier, and we can also go with the Blood Sucking tier, which this tier actually does make me drain my health, which at around about 60 vigor. It's roughly 1% HP per second, but it does boost my damage by 20%, which the health draining mechanic can just be completely negated by the skill, because we're getting so much health regen back with every single hit, and also every single kill. And we do have a Faith build, so therefore we can use some health regen types of spells, like Blessing of the Erd Tree. Also gonna go with the Erd Tree heal because it just gives you so much of your health back. And with things like the Erd Tree seal, you can like definitely heal an entire health bar, doesn't matter how big it is, as long as you do have respectable faith, which yes, we do have only about 57 faith, which is like more than enough for the entirety of base game. And at this level, the Godslayer seal is gonna perform better, but I still recommend us going with the Erd Tree seal because it does eventually outclass the Godslayers at around about 70 faith. Now in terms of some damaging based spells, you honestly don't need much. I have Rotten Butterflies just to proc Rot, because it is a 30% version of Rot, and this spell can just do it in an instant. It's gonna be more useful against bosses with like really large amounts of health and potentially like a New Game Plus and beyond. I do also have Pest Thread Spears for larger bosses and Knight's Lightning Spear because you actually want to have a different damage type option just in case you do fight those enemies that are like a really resist to fire damage. And then obviously with every single faith build, the Golden Vow Flame Get Me Strength just for some more like damage and damage negation. We also have the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman to counteract the physical damaging penalty that the Fire Scorpion charm gives us. And we do have the Rakshasa set equipped because this set is basically just free damage. The EUPORIA is not only the best twin blade in the game, but it probably is the best primarily holy damaging weapon too, as this thing can actually outdamage all the other twin blades with a pure faith build, especially if you do have those luster effects active, because if you don't know, the more hits that you actually get with the EUPORIA, it'll actually add these damaging buffs onto the weapon itself, which there are two different stacks for it. You can actually just gain the first stack with 3 light attacks or 1 charged heavy, and with an additional 3 light attacks or another charged heavy attack, you're going to gain the second buff, and with both these buffs active, it's going to add roughly 130 more holy damage, and actually turn your skill into a projectile attack. Now, obviously, having the weapon with a full luster effect is going to be for the best, because it makes the projectile attack last a lot longer, can do roughly 50 stance damage, and just melt almost every single boss in the game, unless it like incredibly resist the holy damage. Now, it's still going to be somewhat balanced, because obviously you can't just use it on demand, you have to charge up the weapon first. But the thing is, when you do have it charged up, the buff can last up to 5 minutes, depending on how many times you actually hit with the weapon beforehand. So you can just hit a bunch of enemies before you actually enter a boss room, walk into the boss room, and just lead off the fight with this. Now, still might be somewhat situational because you don't get any hype rumble with the skill. It is a longer animation, so probably like wait until you actually get a pretty decent opening until you can use the skill. But even if you don't use it, you still have probably the best damaging twin blade in the game. And twin blades can actually get some really good DPS, especially with those charged heavy attacks, which is what we're going to spec into. Because alongside the Shard of Alexander to boost the skill damage, we're going to have the multi-hit talismans, Thorny Cracks tier, Holy tier, and the two-handed talisman. So no, we actually aren't going to be using things like the Spikes tier or the Axe talisman, despite going into a charged heavy attack build, and it's because that these talismans and tiers are just going to work better, because they're either going to help boost the damage of also the light attacks and the skill too. Any single time that you have an opening, just spam the charged heavy attacks. It's going to proc the buff in an instant, and it's do amazing damage, especially with these multi-hit talismans. Like even bosses that are pretty resist to holy damage actually still can shred through them as well. But if you actually want us to melt them even faster, we have a faith-based build, so therefore we can use different damaging types of spells. You can use Catch Flame against enemies weaker to fire damage, Rotten Butterflies against bosses with really large amounts of HP, because that Scarlet Rod can just do 30% of an enemy's health bar over 90 seconds. And if you wanted to, Knight's Lightning Spear, Pest Thread Spears, good lightning and physical option, good projectile attacks. Doesn't really matter for the most part because our skill just does double down as a high damaging attack and a projectile attack. The skill projectile doesn't really go that far, so maybe the spells could go further. Could also go with something like Frenzied Burst if you actually wanted to have a sniping option. But yeah, once again, we do have Golden Vow. Not going to go with Flame Gummy Strength because obviously we're mainly doing holy damage, so you actually can go with the Sword of Light because the skill of this weapon actually does give you a 20% boost to holy damage and a body buff, so it can just be the holy based version of Flame Gummy Strength. And once again, if you have a faith build, might as well go with some healing spells too. The Fire Knight's Greatsword is one of the cool weapon additions from the DLC because this is a Colossal Sword that probably gets the best moveset in the entire game, as it does actually offer you that really cool Godslayer's Greatsword light attack combo and the Zweihander heavy into one. So basically it's just like the perfect moveset, while also just getting amazing damage, and with a Faith build it can like out damage all of the other Colossal Swords. So that's basically what we're going to be building towards today. Just gonna meet the minimum requirements of strength and dexterity with the weapon, and just put all the rest of the points into Faith. Slap up things like the Flame Spear, Azure Vor, which this skill, it can be like a high damaging attack that does buff your weapon with 90 more fire damage for roughly 40 seconds. And better yet, you can just fully charge the skill to turn it into a projectile attack that makes it do way more damage, especially if you have the Shard of Alexander and the Godfrey's Icon equipped. Like, you can very well just spam this the entire time, or you could just use like the amazing moveset that the weapon actually has to offer anyway. Which in that instance, we are going to use the two-handed talisman, which is just going to be more damage to like our light attacks and heavy attacks. And we are going to have the Dragon Crest Great Shield talisman for just some more damage negation. I do like to have the Crimson Sea talisman more so for survivability in most cases, but with a Faith build, we can use some healing types of spells, Blessing of the Erd Tree, even heal from afar as well. This can be like really quick heals that can heal like almost your entire health bar in an instant. And pairing it alongside the Erd Tree spell, especially at higher levels of Faith, which we don't really have right now, but alongside the Faith tier, it can help us out a bit more. And any single instance to where like we're almost one-shot, we could just use these spells instead of our healing flask. And by re-allotting our flasks to getting more blue flasks, we can just use some more spells as well, which it once again is like the same spells over and over again. You could use things like Pest Thread Spears or Ancient Daggers, Lightning Strike against larger bosses, Rotten Butterflies. You could use Scarlet Aeonian to actually gain access to this spell, Frenzied Burst if you want a sniping option, and once again Golden Bow, Flame Gummy Strength, and we do have the Fire tier, which you can switch off the Fire tier for something like the Sacred tier. If you do fight enemies that are like really weak to holy damage or like really resist to fire damage, you could switch up the skill to Sacred Blade instead, just for these bosses in particular. But for the most part, and definitely throughout a majority of the base game, I'll just be sticking with a Flame Arts infusion. The Sacred Relic Sword might be the single best weapon at crowd control in the entire game, as it does just clear out an entire room full of enemies in almost an instant. Now, it does have the downside of actually consuming a lot of FP and a lot of stamina, but it definitely is worth it due to how powerful it actually is. Even in boss fights, it's extremely good because you can just sit at the back of the map and just keep spamming it. Now, it's probably not going to be the best in terms of things like DPS, but with this weapon, we're going to be spec'd into a Faith build, so there are lots of other things that we actually can use alongside the Sacred Relic Sword, which with our stats, we actually do have more Faith than Dexterity, but the weapon itself actually does scale best off Dexterity. But to maximize the damage of the skill, which is the best part, we have to sacrifice some weapon damage, which the weapon itself is still perfectly fine. It's a great sword with a decent moveset, actually gets some of the most range in class, and it also does get 110 crit. But another good Dexterity Faith-based option is the Black Knife, and this skill is going to be better at just single target boss damage, and it's going to be easier to use while consuming less FP. As the skill of this weapon does go pretty far, actually has a nice little horizontal spread, so even enemies like to dodge and move around, they're probably still going to get hit. And it also does a destined death damage over time effect, which is like roughly 2% damage over a couple of seconds. And bosses that have really large amounts of health, they're just going to get destroyed. Now, unfortunately, just specifically for the DLC, things like Destined Death and Black Flame have their effects like cut in half, so they're not going to be as efficient there. But with how many more enemies there are weaker to holy damage in the DLC, the damage is still going to be perfectly fine. And even if you actually wanted to use it as a primary option with a weapon, it's still pretty good because those heavy attacks do come out really fast and actually serve as a nice little double hit. But even if you do feel like you were lacking some damage out of the weapons at these closer ranges, that's why we have our spells. We can use things like Catch Flame to just completely negate that. And once again, using things like Knight's Lightning Spear or Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike, Pest Thread Spears, just for some like different damage type coverages, good against multiple different sizes of bosses. And also Rotten Butterflies, once again, you should have this with every single Faith build, and it's going to be extremely good, especially in New Game Plus. And as for the boss, we're going to have Golden Vow alongside Howl of Shibriri, but unfortunately it does make you take 30% more damage. So a good alternative could be the Sword of Light, as that one only does boost holy damage, but it is a 20% buff, so it's going to be perfectly fine for what you want. And as for the talismans, Shard of Alexander, obviously for more skill damage, the Carrion Filigate Crest, because this build is going to be pretty skill spam heavy, and with how expensive the Sacred Relic Sword can be, this is a very nice option. But if you are at higher levels where you have like 35, 40 mind, you don't necessarily need this talisman, and you could go with like the Flox Canvas talisman instead, just for more spell damage. Also going to have the Sacred Scorpion Charm for more holy damage, but it does make us take more physical damage in return. But to counteract that, we actually can use things like the Crimson Sea talisman or the Dragon Crest Shield talisman if you actually wanted to go that route instead. And in our Crystal tier slot, we have the Faith tier and the Holy tier, but once you actually have reached the soft caps of 80 Faith, you can switch out the Faith tier for something like the Opaline tier instead. The Dragon Cult incantations make for one of the best spell types in the entire game, definitely the best pure faith one, because lightning damage is the best elemental damage type due to a lot of enemies being weaker to it, and any single time that it's raining or there's water around, you're just doing like up to 20% more damage. And also some of their options are just broken, especially as of the DLC. Things like Nice Lightning Spear is one of your best, if not your best single target projectile spell, and Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike just destroys everything in an instant. Like, doesn't matter what the boss is, doesn't matter what size it is, it just ruins everything. Fortisax's Lightning Spear can do you pretty well. It's mainly going to be useful against some smaller targets that have the ability to be stun locked. But another reason what makes these spells so good is because as of the DLC, we have multiple different things to actually help boost the damage even further. We can go with the Death Knight set, which actually can boost your damage by 12%. But better yet, we can go with the Priestess Heart transformation, which actually boosts your damage by 20% after being transformed and actually using the buff again, which the buff does last a minute. So constantly using the buff over and over again might be a bit tedious. And obviously you're going to have to be naked when using this transformation, so you're going to be taking a lot more damage as well. And with things like Howler Shiburi being used and the blood sucking tier, we pretty much have like a glass cannon build going on. But if you actually didn't like the idea of having this glass cannon build to where like you die in 2 hits or like the enemy dies in 2 hits, then you could very well just use the Death Knight set instead of the Priestess Heart. And instead of going with Howler Shiburi, you could just go with like a damage negation spell. And instead of the blood sucking tier, you could just go with the Opaline tier or the Faith tier if you haven't already hit the soft caps of 80. But with a pure caster build, we're obviously going to be spec'd into a lot of mines, so we can just constantly use spells. Obviously have Catch Flame for a good quick single target option at closer range. If you wanted to save on FP, then you could use the Coded Sword, which you do just have this sitting in our back pocket, which it actually is a very good weapon, does pure holy damage. So when you do fight enemies weaker to holy damage, you could just use this. This skill actually does go really far and do 35 stance damage in a pretty quick animation. And also, if you do fight those larger bosses that like are 80% resist to lightning damage, like Fortisax or just Ancient Dragons in general, then having Pest Threads or Pest Thread Spears is going to be a must-have. And also Rotten Butterflies too. For like those later New Game Plus iterations where enemies have lots of health, this thing is just going to destroy them. And as for our talismans, we have the Phlox Canvas Talisman. We're not going to bother going with the Faithful Canvas Talisman because that's only a 4% damage boost. You're just much better off just using other different types of talismans, like the Godfrey's Icon, which is just 15% more damage when our spells are fully charged. And we're going to have the Lightning Scorpion Charm for more lightning damage, and to counteract the physical damage penalty, we're going to have the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. And to also help us with survivability, we're going to have the Erdtree Heal and Blessing of the Erdtree. And also keep in mind, if you are going to be using your lightning spells, definitely have the Gravelstone Seal in your offhand to just gain that 15% passive damage boost. But yeah, the entire build is just spamming Nice Lightning Spear or Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike against a bunch of bosses. And when you're fighting trash mobs, just use Catch Flame or the Coded Sword skill, and nothing is going to stand a chance against you. Anyway, that is that now done. If you actually wanted to know more about faith-based related things, don't worry, we're going to have the incantation ranking video coming out soon. And if you haven't already checked out my seal ranking video, I'll link that one down below. But as for the next build video, last but not least is going to be the arcane builds. And don't worry, after I make the top 5 arcane builds, I'm still going to make some more build videos in the future. That just probably won't be just around the meta builds, and it probably end up being something more fun related. So definitely do subscribe if you haven't already, and also follow me on Twitch because I'm live there every single day. So if you do have any questions, definitely pop by. Anyway, see yous.